Hello everyone, how's everybody doing so far? Okay, looks like pretty tired. Okay.
No, it's good. It'll be it'll be intimate, like a
Yeah,
small
sure,
intimate
sure.
conversation.
Yeah, okay,
Always
cool.
fun.
Let's just jump into this fireside chat. Thanks for joining us today, Shayon.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, maybe we can start by having you to introduce yourself and Multicoin.
Yeah. Shayon, I'm a partner on the investment team at Multicoin Capital. Multicoin is a thesis-driven investment firm. We are a hedge fund and a series of venture funds, investing in things at the earliest stages all the way to late stage, public markets. Spend a lot of time on deepens and, generally excited about new models for capital formation and infrastructure build out. And, excited to chat more about deepen and AI.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, so again, my name is Raullen, so I'm the CEO co-founder of IoTeX. So we're kind of like a deepin pioneer since 2017. So we're building like an infrastructure for deepin projects to grow to, kind of easy to build, lower the bar. So what, fascinates me about deepin is the ability to bring together like a real world use cases to crypto. Like maybe we have too much meme coins already, right? So that's why we need something real. So with that being in mind, maybe Shayon, you can start to share by sharing like why deeping is so interesting to you and your philosophy about deeping and your investment thesis here.
Yeah, I think when you look at how infrastructure networks are built out in the world, historically they've been extremely capital intensive, required central planning, and been relegated to a handful of pools of capital and a handful of like centralized operators, which is inherently inefficient. I think what struck us first, which the first canonical example of a deeper network, was helium, and what we observed there was a structural inversion of that build out. This notion of taking what would traditionally be capex and turning it into opex, allowing a distributed network of contributors to put up infrastructure in a decentralized manner and deliver a parity service, whilst not having to take on any of the costs of building out that network on the balance sheet. That represented sort of a fundamentally new business model for building out infrastructure, which is inherently capex heavy, and one that's sort of uniquely enabled by crypto rails. It's very difficult today to go out into the world and incentivize anyone in the world to do something very specific, because you might be dealing with difficulties in payments and difficulties in, figuring out how to get value across. But what crypto capital markets and crypto rails do is they allow you to borrow from the future through this new asset and then take that asset and distribute it to anyone in the world who wants to be a contributor to this network. And so we've seen that now, that core principle that Helium really sort of pioneered, applied across new types of wireless networks, new types of compute networks, new types of energy networks, anything really where you can think of a single large player taking on a ton of equity or debt in order to build out something massive can theoretically, in many cases, be done through a distributed network, at a substantially better cost structure. And we're seeing that now in, the first few years of Deepins were entirely about supply side construction. We're starting to see now that those networks with this consumer grade footprint that's been built out are actually economically productive and are delivering the same quality of service at a substantially lower cost. And when I think about what you can do with why we're all here and why we invest in and spend time in this space, I think of that as like a net new unlock and a new business model. And I think it's super compelling.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Starting from this year, so we're seeing like the demand side has been like a really like a central topic for deeping networks, right? So you kind of mentioned about this new way to building this physical infra networks in a very decentralized way. But like as we observe, so there is some like a bottleneck here, which is like the quality of the service, right? If you're like a data network, like what type of data you're collecting, what type of quality you have, Helium the same, right? So we are, of course, Helium a very close friend with us, but like some of the service they're providing are not top of the quality. So how do you see this as a bottleneck? Like maybe we can overcome, while we are still kind of building around deeping.
Yeah. So I think this is sort of how you start segmenting the supply side of these networks. you will always have high quality contributors and low quality contributors. And I think inherent to the build out, depending on what the network is, at scale, every network eventually needs some version of a reputation system. And usually, early versions of this look like live peer, where nodes would have to put up their own bonds and eventually get slashed or rewarded for doing certain kinds of work. And then that could be like a system over time to say, this is a good node, this is a bad node, this is an economically productive node, this is an economically unproductive node. So that's reputation. And the second component of that is verification, which is like being able to prove that a specific contributor to the network or a specific unit on the supply side is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And I think there's like a ton of different ways of establishing that. Inherently, a lot of the supply side here, whether it's a, RTK base station in the case of GeoNet or a wireless access point that does carrier offload for MNOs, in the case of Helium Mobile, a lot of the work that they're doing is off chain, which is, it's very hard to like take that piece of real world state and put it on chain. But there's obviously new primitives, things like zkTLS and things of its kin that are making it possible to do that over time, which is take this piece of off-chain state that is a critical component to thinking about how productive is this supply side node. And in general, as you're building out, and you and I have probably seen tons of deeper networks be either capital efficient or capital inefficient in how you build out supply side, which is you only want to reward good productive nodes. You do not want to reward bad, spammy, potentially botted nodes, right?
That's right.
And so I think every network has its own set of considerations. If you're a browser extension, for instance, it's much easier for that to get botted than purchasing a piece of hardware that only comes from a specific maker where the firmware is stamped with a, provenance or a piece of authenticity about like this is an actual device that's actually in the world, right? So I think over time, every network has to develop its own reputation systems and its own verification systems, and then thoughtfully curate the supply side, remove the bad stuff, keep the good stuff, and build out the network with demand in mind for that reason.
That's a really good point. So not sure if you guys understand like IoTeX. So we have like two infra components that exactly, building for this purpose. One is called IOID, is trying to building like a different reputation for different devices. And another one is called like a web stream. It's kind of like a Z-key kind of prover for all the off-chain activities, right? Along the same line you were talking about. But what you said actually, makes me think there might be another bottleneck we have in the DePIN space, because everything kind of starts very rough. Then we do the optimization, like you said, right? So we say, oh, this device is doing well. We give them like more tokens. This is not. So this will take a lot of, time, while like the network in terms of like the mining tokens is actually bleeding, because every day this much of token gets, dumped to the market. Let's assume that, right? So do you think there's a concern? Like as a DP network, you only have like a certain, like a window to actually grow to a certain state before you die.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely not free, right? Like you got like building out a massive supply side that, ostensibly is like some nice headline number, a few 100,000 nodes always sounds good, but it could theoretically be extremely expensive. And if it isn't verified, if it isn't reputable, if it's not actually producing, net new dollars for your network, it's a problem. And I think, the good news is there's a lot of good models that are, teams that have done an exceptional job of building out productive supply in a very capital efficient way. I think that the team that comes to mind that has, that's been the best about this is HiveMapper, which is having mapped on the order of a fifth of the world's productive roads, with, sub 10% or something around that much of the supply. They were very deliberate about the fact that they would reward on a weekly cadence. They would make sure that all of the data was, post-processed and sort of not unproductive data. They would, specify specific regions, specific hexes where, they know that like they have X customer that needs this tomorrow. And so suddenly, that region will have a 10x boost on rewards relative to everywhere else. Regions that are not productive would be deprioritized, so I think supply always needs to be built hand in hand with demand. I think the meta of just like indiscriminately building a ton of supply, is ultimately costly. And you pay for that either in the form of like either giving those nodes too many tokens, or you pay for that in the form of and obviously creating a bunch of sell pressure once it's out there.
Yeah.
Or you pay for that, and if you want to like, or you pay for that by giving each one of those nodes not enough tokens, which like does the opposite effect of what you were trying to do in the first place. And so I think the encouragement that I give to all of the teams in my portfolio and whoever I'm talking to is to be very thoughtful about building what I call threshold scale, which is you have a specific demand side customer in mind and basically build out supply until you can unlock that customer and don't reward anything else. Like just build out enough supply, prove that you can get that first, and think about that customer thoughtfully. Right? Yeah. Think about who you can actually sell to. Like on day one, you're probably not going to sell to Apple, right? You could probably sell to someone else, right? So have that customer in mind, know what they want, build around them, and then turn it up again from there.
So this puts a very strong assumption on the team. Like you have to have a domain expertise, right? In whether in transportation, in whatever thing you're building. You cannot just building like a general purpose thing and try it out, right? So I think that's kind of takeaway here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like many people have entered new markets, like, Travis Kalanick didn't know anything about taxis when he built Uber, and I don't think the Airbnb guys knew anything about hotels. So I'm not suggesting that like people who don't have domain expertise can't build big networks, but they should be very clear with themselves about this is the economic value that I think this network will produce, and be realistic about that, as opposed to posturing wildly that if we build this data set, build this supply, build whatever it is, the demand will show up, because it doesn't. There are exactly zero cases of demand coming organically to things that are not real.
You only have a few time to try and error, basically, right? Okay, so with that, so we can kind of switch gear a little bit towards the AI, because everybody's now actually we're living an AI age right now. So I use ChatGPT. I spend a lot of time talking with ChatGPT more than talking with my wife, unfortunately.
It's going to be a problem, Raullen. You got to fix that.
Okay. So yeah, so we can see like robots, autonomous vehicles, drones everywhere. So how do you think about, deepin serving as a backbone for AI, or AI serving as something for deepin?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way we outlined the stack in December of 2022, the month after ChatGPT launched, in my head, I had sort of compute models data as like a very broad way to think about things. And I think to this date, still like that is a decent segmentation of like the resources, the inputs that go into anything that's productive in AI. Obviously, the way you sort of like the way you slice it is important. But like as with everything, every new domain, all the infrastructure, all the projects, all the teams, all the intellectual capital goes at the lowest layer of the stack, which is compute. And so we've seen some version of a compute market that uses crypto incentives to build out supply, and with that aggregated capacity tries to deliver compute services at structurally lower costs for a variety of use cases. That specific thing has existed in crypto for at least 7 years. What we've seen happen in the last 18 months or so is more verticalization, which is to say, this compute network is specifically designed for a specific type of inference, or this compute network is specifically designed for a specific type of post-training or pre-training, or this specific network is very good at inference time compute. I think you will end up having supply that ends up serving a specific use case slightly better. But I think compute networks are the core layer. That's where a lot of the liquid returns have been, and that's where you've sort of seen the most tangible progress amongst things that are at the intersection of capital formation via deep-in mechanisms and AI systems. I think the more open questions in my mind are, how do you start moving up the stack, which is how do you build crypto mechanisms to coordinate things at the model or the data layer. We've obviously seen things like data DAOs also for a few years. We've seen, new ways of aggregating or contributing to models with specific types of data. There are a handful of teams that are taking, very credible bets in those spaces. But my, my fear with sort of those layers of the stack is very similar to what I was saying in terms of like knowing the demand side.
Right.
At the compute layer, you can sort of reason about the fact that if I can get this compute at 60 cents an hour, I can, sell it at least 61 cents an hour, or, slightly above 60 cents. When the centralized compute providers are charging $1 an hour, there's a business there. I can clearly say that, like, I can clearly call someone up and say, hey, I will give you the same product for cheaper. I don't think there's such a clear way to think about that for data and models as of yet, right? For the other two layers of the stack, because data is inherently not heterogeneous. It's not homogeneous. It's extremely, there's extreme variance in dataset A versus dataset B, and the customer of dataset A versus dataset B may need very different things, and your ability to kind of acquire those datasets may be different. And so I think we're gonna see a lot of interesting stuff at the model and data layers, but I think those attempts need to be very plugged into reality with the demand side.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Basically, like in AI, there are like a few basic elements, right? So data being one of those, GPU compute is another one, maybe algorithm. So that's kind of like an open chat GPT or like, Google is working on. And also energy is kind of behind the scene to support like the compute over there, right? So yeah, so that's also how I think about, so deep in AI can kind of fuse together. We don't see anything like a clear on the data side. That's kind of interesting because I was doing a lot of like AI learning recently. So, the large language model, which will take like a three type of data. One is like a very kind of stale data. That's kind of like your mathematics, textbook, Wikipedia data. So that's for the foundation of the model to learn how the human kind of physical law works. And on the other side of the spectrum is like an API, kind of real-time data. That's kind of like a temperature data, transportation data, weather data, so on and so forth. So those are like a real-time data, BTC price, right? So, but like in the middle, so there is some data that's kind of missing, not easy to get. That's also very valuable. So, like examples are like your medical history, your like a phone usage, right? So your conversation with another person, even Reddit data. So those things are very useful to train the models to understand even deeper about the human, behavior and society. Do you see there any like a chance here?
Yeah, I feel very optimistic about the types of data that are hard to acquire or expensive. Like you think about like what Scale AI does as its core line of business today. It's not sort of labeling and annotations on like this is a car or this is a cat. It's much more specialized today than it used to be, because most of these models, most of the language models in the world have already reached the limit of sort of the public, like whatever's on the public internet, and they've reached some sort of diminishing returns on like, indexing the next 50,000 web pages and like trying to parse it together. Like it's not that useful. Right. Everything now is about, doing annotations or post training or fine tuning by, if you're building a medical model, having 20 doctors around the world sort of, look at specific molecules or specific charts or specific things and saying, this is this, this is this, this is this, and then post training based on that. And so I think there's a real opportunity to get, some of that specialized labor, like hyper verticalized labor, and then, contributing to certain data sets, to make those models better. I definitely think there's a world where, crypto incentives can be helpful for that. I also generally think that the most valuable data sets for these models inherently have to be the ones that are not publicly accessible easily. And so if you think about that, like you were saying with health data or, personal financial data, transaction data, consumer data, that's the kind of stuff that most consumers are maybe a little bit more, sensitive to. And so I think there are approaches in, fully homomorphic encryption or privacy preserving compute that are potentially going to be very helpful there, which is, getting people to become, I heard that there's a way for you to go on Amazon and listen to everything that your Alexa has recorded, from its interactions with you. And there are specific data DAOs in existence today where you can upload those recordings.
Really? That means that Amazon owns everything I said to Alexa?
And you can access those recordings if you want to. And you can sell those recordings. Now, the reason you and I haven't heard of it is because like most people don't want to do that. It's extremely creepy. It's like not not cool.
Uh-huh.
But if there was a way to do that in a privacy preserving way, maybe you could, maybe that pushes you slightly over the edge, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know how valuable Alexa data is, but there's definitely a lot, you know, with enough scale, it is absolutely going to be helpful in some way. And that's the other thing is like we've seen data DAOs in some instantiation for many years. The problem they've always had is like 50, like the consumer data of 50 people is useless. The consumer data of 500 people is slightly less useless, but still pretty useless. The consumer data of 500,000 people is starting to become useful. The consumer data of 50 million people is now useful. So all of these things need scale. And I think we've just sort of seen a certain natural limit on attaining scale. And that's mostly, I think, a function of like poor execution. And I think that'll change.
That's right. That's a very interesting point, actually. So for the data side, maybe we have a different kind of methodology to build, right? Compared to the utility side. Because for utility, you know, it's 5G, it's like a Wi-Fi, it's Uber. So you kind of building from the supply side all the way to the demand side. But the data is actually on the reverse way, right? So you know the demand first. Oh, maybe this is to train this medical robot, right? Then you kind of try back here to find where the data sources are. That's a very good point, actually. You know, switching a gear a little bit, I was chatting with like a Shayon about like the micro market. Actually, the BTC is, you know, dropping under 85, I think, right now, right? So, and also US stock is doing terrible. So does this change how you guys do investment? And, you know, what's your kind of thoughts here?
Yeah, I don't know anything about macro. I don't get paid to do that. We don't.
Not a financial advice.
Yeah, I generate alpha through asset selection. I don't trade beta at all. It doesn't change anything about the way I invest.
Are you guys still looking at like early stage deals and or maybe liquid token?
All the time. BTC could go to 60K and I would be looking at early stage deals.
Yeah. I saw you guys recently invest into like a GeoDNet, right? So they are also like working with us very closely, actually using some of our infra pieces here. So what's your sort of like a thesis and also thinking process for investment into GeoDNet?
Yeah, we're super excited about GeoDNet. For those who don't know what GeoDNet is the largest RTK base station network in the world. What RTK base stations do is they provide sub-centimeter positioning for devices in any part of the world. And so the idea is if you're roaming around, your GPS will tell you where you are, but it'll have some degree of error. It'll probably be 5 to 10 meters off. That's okay if you're just walking around Denver. But if you are a piece of equipment that's operating in critical infrastructure, like some sort of precision agricultural equipment or a drone or a robot of some kind that's in a really, mission critical scenario, you need to know exactly where you are. Otherwise you can cause, it creates problems for whatever use case you're doing. And so what GeoDNet does is it puts up these receivers that are on the ground that take your GPS location and then essentially triangulate your location with slightly higher precision.
Yeah.
And slightly is an understatement there, with substantially higher precision. So you go from like an error rate of about 5 to 10 meters to sub-centimeter. Now, if you are an autonomous vehicle or you are a drone or you are, some sort of humanoid robot in your house, you're going to use a bunch of different methods to figure out where you are physically. You might use radar or LiDAR or SLAM or any number of other like computer vision based methods. But these are all sort of like, they all have some degree of error. There's some, they're not inherently foolproof. And so what GeoDNet does is it adds another layer of redundancy. And we generally expect if you talk to frankly, every single device in the world, manufacturer in the world that can be considered to be building robots, every single one of them has RTK base station based GPS corrections as a core part of their stack. And so, our bet on GeoDNet is obviously Mike Horton, who's the founder, has had a, decades long career understanding all of the manufacturers, all of the makers in that industry. And he's established that using deep in economics, he can build out a RTK base station network that can deliver comparable quality of service at an order of magnitude lower cost. So he is currently competing with publicly traded companies, the Hexagons, the Trimbles of the world, that are providing RTK base stations and positioning services to all of these robotics manufacturers, and he's undercutting their prices by 90%, and he's winning deals left, right, and center. So that's a canonical example of, a deep and well designed with the customer in mind. And we generally think that the set of customers for that product are going to tenfold in the next 5 years. It's going to be every single robot that you can sort of see and interact with in the world is going to be a customer of GeoNet services. So that's the thesis.
Yeah, this sounds like a kind of like a new foundation for the entire, what they call like a physical AI world, right? Basically like a world like a full of autonomous vehicles, robots kind of, working, or like a mechanical dogs, you see. So they can all use this like a foundational, like a GPS coordinates to locate themselves.
Yeah, exactly. These devices are useless if they don't have what's called spatial awareness. If they don't know where they are, they aren't able to function because they're inherently required to interact with the physical world. If they don't know where they are in the physical world, they can't really do what they want to do. And, there will always be cameras. There will always be LiDAR. There will always be other methods. But sensor fusion is the predominant way in which people position themselves. And that means you need to have more than one input. And whatever set of inputs exist for any of these robots, GNSS corrections will unequivocally be one of the inputs. So we see GeoNet as like a supplier to every single robot that is on the earth in 5 years.
Yeah. Do you see other kind of data or utility that will be also useful to those physical AI? Like example would be like the Helium LoRa network, right? So we talked before. So they're like a long range, like a low bandwidth type of network. So yeah, so people were touted about, so this being the foundational network for IoT devices, which unfortunately didn't happen actually until now. But do you see other kind of like a GeoDNet sort of like a utility for those robots?
Yeah, I mean, so LoRa is LoRa is still like a very, I think, important and productive, wireless standard. Being able to power applications with long range and low battery is obviously a very important input for anything that's considered robotic or autonomous. I think just relative to things like consumer mobile internet connections, the dollars in that market are much smaller. Inherently because like for each one of those devices, your willingness to pay is just smaller, right? But I generally think that that's, if you expect there's going to be more robots in the world, like Helium IoT line of business is going to do pretty well. I think there's going to be a bunch of services in terms of figuring out, not specifically where is that robot, but what's the battery level on that robot? Are there firmware problems that need to be resolved? Is it, like different pieces of state that you inherently want to be like energy sensitive and long range. I think there's going to be a ton of those things there.
Yeah.
So
I think some example is like where can this car find a cheap connectivity, cheap power, or even some microclimate, right? So around this car. So those are super, I think, deeping kind of centric like data, right?
Yeah, totally.
Very cool. I think we can take maybe like one question from the audience if you guys have, for even Shayon or me. Any volunteer questions? Guys, don't lose this opportunity talking with the two smartest guys, in crypto. All right.
Yeah. I don't know if you can talk anything about the regulatory reform in the US. I'd like to see around these token projects that are using token incentives to drive behavior.
Yeah. I think I'm very optimistic. It's very hard to make like strong statements about this stuff, but our council and our legal and policy teams are spending a lot of time in DC trying to talk to regulators as much as they can. And my intuition is that we're going to have thoughtful policy, that essentially makes it possible for new businesses that are, taking dollars on one end in terms of revenues and able to somehow tether those revenues to an asset. I can't say with conviction what the mechanics of that are going to be, whether it's going to be a buyback or some sort of distribution or, a dividend, all of these things are unclear. What I will say is that the regulatory posture that we are in today is substantially better today than it was 18 months ago. And my sense is that it's going to continue to get better over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. It's clear that this administration wants to make the US the home for crypto. And I really don't think it's possible to do that if you can't present a compelling story for why these assets should be valuable. And, governance value is frankly just not is only going to invite a small enough pool of capital. The second these things start looking like cash flow assets in whatever capacity, I think it's extremely time expansionary for the kinds of people who are interested in investing, in these assets. And so I feel very optimistic. Obviously, I can't make any strong statements, but my guess is that in 12 months, you will see many new sort of many businesses that were not deepins want to become deepins because they can access crypto capital markets. They can, frankly, find a way to access liquidity and, take advantage of going public on chain in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so IoTeX team, we actually have been working with some lawmakers since last year, December-ish in Washington, right? So one data point that we can share is in the past, buy back your token and then burn, actually deem your token as a security, which is no longer the case. So that's why, so we're optimistic about the coming future for the token. All right, maybe Frank?
Yeah, I have two questions. Number one, how do you value that? Number two, what's your expectation of revenue that's gonna make you, satisfied to
Yeah, I think I value GeoNet in the most crude way possible, which is I put a multiple on the revenues that are burnt on chain. I can't disclose exactly the terms of our transaction, but I can tell you that it was cheaper than every single crypto AI deal that I've ever seen in the last 6 months.
Yeah, it's expensive, right?
Yeah, it's pretty expensive. And then on the revenue side, our time horizon for this stuff is 5-10 years. We only consider investment successful when we are distributing the tokens in kind to our LPs. I, never want to consider GeoNet a success. I want it to continue compounding for as long as possible. And so I don't really have a target that would make me feel happy with it or want to de-risk or take a position off. I can just say that if you go on the Dune dashboards today, you can see a very non-linear curve on the revenue, on the on-chain revenue burns. So you can kind of project forwards out from there.
Thank you. Maybe one last question.
Questions would be deep in the energy sector. In the energy sector, there are multiples of these projects and ideas since 2016-17, trying to get some kind of incentive-based approach to get efficiency from photovoltaics and different kind of energy sources, but none of them did actually manage to succeed. And do you believe, and it's because of the landscape of the industry, do you believe it's the timing right now that some kind of those projects could now evolve with what's happening in the United States or the world? What's your opinion?
Yeah, so energy is... So there's two reasons why it's been hard so far. One is energy is one of the most regulated markets in the world. Even in the unregulated states in the US, there are, a ton of different, components and regulatory pieces that you need to get and licensure that you need to operate in any part of the US. And the second is that it's very hard to have global network effects or global coverage because each, sometimes every city has a different generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure. So building a specific protocol that everyone in the world can be a part of is extremely difficult. What I'd say is, I think a few things have changed. One is every single year, the demand for energy up until we can get nuclear energy that is, producing the vast majority of energy in the world. Until we get to that point, the grid infrastructure for even most of the developed world is falling over, which means that the low-hanging fruit is to essentially load balance the grid correctly. And I think we've seen a handful of teams try to go after that specific problem. They don't do it in a global context. They do it in a local context. But what you need for that is to be able to market to consumers. You need to be able to use tokens in crypto capital markets to change the incentives of people at the edge, right? And that requires really strong consumer instinct, really strong domain expertise in how energy markets work, and some degree of regulatory cover. And those things have not all lined up for whatever reason over the last 5 or 6 years. I think that's changing now. I think the fact that people feel comfortable going to a consumer and saying you will get tokens in your wallet if you reduce your consumption at, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., thereby load balancing the grid, allowing us to arbitrage wholesale power versus retail power, and we'll return those dollars back to you. That whole flow was not possible 5 years ago. I think it's becoming possible now under the current regulatory environment, under the quality of founder that's interested in building in the space, and under just sort of like the overall need for that piece of infrastructure. So we have investments in that space. A lot of other people do as well. And I feel optimistic that we'll see something really promising there.
Yeah, I think another two things that are actually also evolving the past 5 years is the nuclear energy technique, right? So like solar panels, thanks to Tesla, Solar City. So they are more advanced compared to 5-10 years ago. The second one is demand for energy is very high thanks to AI in a way, right? So people are kind of needing more energy to power those like data centers. So those things are kind of stimulates the DeFi, like energy sector for now. Cool. I think that's it, right? So yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank
really
you for having me.
enjoying, chatting with you. Thank you. All right. Thanks, man.